Hello folks, welcome to the first video of a series about creating a website with a backend. We are going to focus in this one more on the backend parts of a website. We are going to do some front end, but we will look into the database, web services, and all the stuff which is there on the backend way more. This series is focused on people who already know a bit of development, so know basics of coding. And we're going to do this in Python. So if you don't know how to code in Python as well, you should probably first watch some other videos and learn a bit of that. So it will be a bit more understandable. In this case, in this example, we are going to create a website, let's call it Cookboot, to use to store recipes, to create new recipes, to store, retrieve recipes. That's actually a problem I hit myself. I recently started cooking and then I didn't want to do it like in a paper form. So I decided to play a bit with Python and create a website. Now, first a bit of basics. So what we're looking at is we want to create a server, a web server, and the typical flow, the basic flow is that a user sends an HTTP request, something like www.cookboot.com recipe my tasty avocado, which would be a specific recipe name. And then the server gets this request and replies back with something like maybe a JSON with a name and ingredients and things like that. And by the way, this should be like this. So that's great and perfect, and this is where we're going to start. If we look a bit under the hood into this server machine, then what happens when a request arrives is, well, it arrives to some specific port, and then something else should listen to this port for the new data. We call this typically a web server, an application which runs on the machine and listens for the new data, for new requests. And when this new data comes, this web server should invoke some logic, and the logic typically lives somewhere else. The thing which is important here is there needs to be a connection between the web server, which just listens to ports, and some more custom specific logic that we want for our website. If we look a bit more for a specific example of a request, like www.cookboot.com/recipe/mytastyavocado, then the blue part is the part of the address of the URL which helps to find the specific machine in the internet. So it helps to arrive to this port. And then the red part, this is a kind of an internal route. This is on the machine route to a specific resource that user wants to get. And web frameworks or API frameworks help us typically connect a web server, so the one who just listens, to a specific logic which we want to execute on a request. And then in addition, maybe do some cleanup and small stuff and things like that. So we're going to do it in Python. In Python, there is a standard, an interface called WSGI, and actually another one called ASGI. Before these were created by the Python itself, there was a ton of different frameworks which used very different approaches to this problem of connection of a listener to the logic. At some point, it was like a huge zoo. Python made a great job on standardizing this, first with WSGI, with this server gateway interface. The problem with it, though, was that this is a synchronous interface, which means if a request arrives and it's processed for a while, if it takes time, for example, we got a request, we go to database to get some stuff from the database, and it might take time to get this data. Then because it's synchronous, nothing else can be processed until this request is finished, a new one will not start. And this is, of course, a problem if you want to scale your service. And so later, an asynchronous version was introduced called ASGI, with A for asynchronous here. And in Python, there are many web frameworks who implement these standards, these interfaces. Those include Falcon, Fast, Flask, Flask is actually a very popular, simple one. Fast is another very popular, kind of new modern one. Falcon is maybe not the most popular, but that's the one that I'm going to use soon on my real work project. So that's why I'm going to use Falcon as well here in this one, in this trial project. In addition, we need the actual web server, the one who listens. We are going to use uvicorn, which is a very popular Python web server, which supports ASGI, which is nice. We're also going to use httpie, which is a very nice application for doing requests from the command line. So before we will get the the nice web before we get a nice UI in the browser, we'll definitely going to use command line a lot for checking how our web server works. And then also I'm going to use Conda for managing Python environments. If you don't know what Python environments are, I highly recommend to learn more. This will allow us to isolate dependencies and packages for this our project from any others, including specific versions. So I can have a dedicated version of Python, and all packages like HTTP, uvicorn, Falcon, all those packages will have specific versions for this project, for the Cookboot project, separate from the rest, from other Python projects that I have on my machine. Now, how will this work? Well, if we grab a few terminals, and you can see by Cook, this is already the name of the Python environment. So thanks Conda. In one window, we will have a server, which will start like this with a uvicorn app semicolon app. I will later explain what these names mean. But now we have our server running. And then we can have a second window where we can do a request. And this can be something like this. So HTTP, well, 127.0.0.1 means localhost. So my own machine port 8000 is default HTTP port. And then recipes / myavocado recipe is a unique route. And then when we run this, we can back a string tasty stuff, my avocado recipe. That's some string returned from the server. And on the server side, you can see we got a GET request with this route, recipes, my avocado recipe. And we responded 200, which means, okay, everything went well. So how all of this is bind? So uvicorn is just a web server. When we start uvicorn, it doesn't know what to do with a specific route. So for example, if here, instead of this, I will ask, let's say for a book, let's say, show me all books. I will get 404 not found because uvicorn has no idea what to do with the route books. We need to bind some logic to this route, and that's where Falcon comes in. In our case, well, I skipped actual installation, but installation is absolutely straightforward for the Falcon and other apps. Well, if you are actually doing this with Conda, as I'm using here Conda, then instead of pip install, you will use Conda install. But then again, the rest is really straightforward. You can Google if you want a specific command. Well, I can even show you, so you can easily do something like conda install, let's say Falcon, and then Conda has a very nice front where you will get, you can see the version for each platform, and then running this command in your command line will give you Conda, and the same goes for uvicorn, for HTTP, and all those others applications that I was talking here about. Now, going to the code. This app file holds the entry point for the application. You can see that I'm importing falcon.asgi. If I would not use ASGI, I can use regular Falcon, import Falcon, and then I will have stuff like falcon.app, which is the entry point thing, but this app will be the WSGI. So this would be the WSGI version, which is synchronous, which is blocking and slow. And so we don't want this. That's why we are going to use falcon.asgi. And then from those, what we use is we called .app, and this will create the application class. And this is a really important part of the binding. So you see that I put this into the variable called app. And this has to be named exactly the same way as I want here to start my server. So when I run uvicorn app semicolon app, the first app of these two refers to the file name. So here my file is called app.py, you see at the top. The second one refers to this variable name. If I rename this to my app, for example, well, and then let's for now comment this out. Then to start this server, now if I start it like this, just like app.app, I'll get an error saying attribute app not found. Because now, because I renamed it to my app, it here has to be my app. And now we have the server. So let's return here back things like they were. So that's the first one, a really important part. And again, if this name instead of app.py would be something, I don't know, crazy.py, then here it would also have to be crazy. Now, that's nice. How do we add a specific route? So when we have our server running, so we have our server running, and then we hit something like recipes, we get, let's say, a list of all recipes. Well, it's right now one text string, but you can imagine it's a list. How does the server knows, how does uvicorn knows that this specific part of the URL, the recipes, should map to this return, to this output? It's done by adding routes. So you take the app, create it, and then when we call add route, the first argument, it's the URL, so recipes, and the second one is a resource. And resource is a class that we are going to talk in a minute. This way of binding is specific to Falcon. Other frameworks can do it a bit differently. Falcon is centered like it's REST-based, and REST has resources in a core, and so Falcon has the same. When I bind a specific part of the URL, I have to provide a class. In this case, it will be a recipe resource, an instance of a class. And that instance, that class, has to have some specific methods like onGet, or it can be onPost. If it will not have those methods, then Falcon will say, hey, this is not a resource because there are no methods there. If they are, Falcon will do some magic and automatically do the binding for us, which will allow us to do these kind of things. Now, also something important, we're going to change code here to avoid stopping the server again and starting again to see the changes. We can start uvicorn with a flag reboot. No, not reboot, reload. And now each time we're going to do any changes, like let's say I'll add even some comment here, we can see that the server will restart and we can immediately try our changes. Well, the comment will do nothing, so we can remove it. Now, so what are those Falcon resources? Here I have a file called recipe resource. Again, Falcon doesn't care how do I name it. What Falcon cares about is these voids. It's also important because we want to use a synchronous way of dealing with requests. It's important that we declare async versions. So this would not be, it's not mandatory. I could still declare a non-async version, like on get. But because I'm going to use it in the async here, because my application was created as an async application, this one now Falcon requires me to do it async. If I would create an WSGI version, not an ASGI, but WSGI, it could be just def. Because we're doing asynchronous, we are going, but that's also what you want. You want to declare it async. On get, it really has to be on and then one of those HTTP verbs like get. It has to have exactly 3 parameters: self, request, and response. All of those type hinted. It will return a callable, so kind of a function. And now inside, this is the logic that what happens when we get a get request to this resource. So by binding it to receives, we know, hey, whenever there will be request/receives, we should go to this class, which means receive resource class. And if request was a get, then on get will happen. And what we will return in the response, so we have here the response object, and we can put the status, in this case 200, because everything is okay. Content type, for now this is just text. Later it can be something different like JSON. And because we say that it will be text, the content type, we can set response.text to some text. In this case it's a list. Later we will have here a real list of stuff. Now, something very typical is when you want to have parameters or parameterized request here, for example, a specific recipe. So what's typical when you do APIs and HTTP APIs is that the /recipes should return everything, when recipe/ID should return a specific ID. For example, here we can say that, let's switch here, this should return by convention everything, but then something like my avocado recipe should return specific recipe. In this case, a tasty stuff, my avocado recipe. The way how Falcon binds this is twofold. On one hand, you can see that this second method is the one which handles parameterized call. You see it's on get, and then there is a suffix. It is called recipe. It's really important that this suffix is equivalent to this suffix. If I here will say something like recipe blah, then we can check that we get an error when restarting the service. That is because like the error is no responders found for the specific route. That is because this suffix is now not identical to suffix on this method. So this is where Falcon goes with all this magic, like parsing the files and doing matching of the method names. Some find it convenient. I actually find it less convenient. I would prefer that I would have a method here which I can call what I want, and then somewhere above here I would have something like a decorator or something which will allow me to say this corresponds to, you know, receive/ID. I would prefer it to be like this here, but well, it is what it is. Falcon does it this way. It's really important to match the suffix, and it's also important to match the ID. So here the ID is recipe ID, and you can see this method second takes one additional argument, and this exactly has to be named ID. Again, if I call it ID here, and well, ID here, then it restarted, which is nice. But then when we do this one, you will see server error, because this parameter doesn't match this one. And if we now return this back to receive ID so that they match, the routing one. And we do again the same request. Now we got back the tasty avocado recipe. So for now, let's pause here. This was the basic routing. Later, we're both going to look how we do the post, how we store and retrieve these, and something different important which I'll talk about is a specific folder structure that I will be targeting here. But this is already quite long, 20 minutes. Thanks for being with me. See you later. Ciao.